Section 5.1, we're going to talk about congruent triangles. So what does it mean for two triangles to be congruent? To say that two triangles are congruent means that they're identical twins. Identical means that everything is the same. That means the sides and the angles are the same, which means congruent. So here's an example. If two congruent triangles could be placed on top of each other, like this, the angles and sides that match up and are congruent are called congruent parts. So A and J are congruent angles, K and B are congruent angles, and L and C are congruent angles. And then the sides that match up are also congruent. So let's list all of the congruent parts. So we know, so angle A is congruent to angle J because they match up. Oops, right, angle A first. Angle B, and we're going to use 2 tick marks now, is congruent to angle K because they match up. And angle C, we'll use 3 tick marks, is congruent to angle L because they match up. And now we're going to match all the corresponding sides. Okay, side AB is congruent to side JK because they match up. And anytime we talk about sides, we're talking about segments, so we need to say segment AB is congruent to segment JK. Then we have segment BC is congruent to segment KL because they match up. And last but not least, we have segment AC is congruent to segment JL because they match up. And for each new side and each new angle, I use a different amount of tick marks because they can be different lengths than the previous set of congruent parts. So these are two identical triangles. All of the angles are congruent and all of the sides are congruent, and that's what makes them congruent triangles. So given that these two triangles are congruent, let's list the congruent parts. Okay, so if I put these on top of each other, M matches up with angle Q, so we can say angle M, that is not an M, angle M is congruent to angle L, or sorry, angle Q. Then we can say angle L matches up with angle P, so they're congruent. And angle N matches up with angle R, so they are congruent. And now let's do the sides. So side ML is congruent to side QP with the segment bar over the top because they are segments. Side LN is congruent to side PR because they match up. And side MN is congruent to side QR. And we know that because the two triangles are congruent. So all the angles, all the corresponding angles that match up are congruent, and all the corresponding sides that match up are congruent. Now, a congruent statement can be used to find corresponding parts of the congruent triangles. So these triangles are reflected. So it might not be as easy to identify congruent parts, but we can just use the congruent statement, which is actually a lot more accurate. So the first letter matches or corresponds to the first letter over here. And the second letter matches with the second letter, and the third letter matches with the third letter. So we know angle J is congruent to angle R, and you can see that in your picture as well. We know that the second letter, angle K, is congruent to angle S, and you can see that in your picture, and they're already marked congruent because they're both 90-degree angles. And then our third letter, we can see that angle L is congruent to angle T, so we can use 2 tick marks here because they are both the third letter, so they correspond. And now we can also use this congruency statement to write our congruent sides. So look at the first 2 letters. Side JK is congruent to side RS. We can use our second two letters. So side KL is congruent to side ST. You can also see that in your picture. And we can look at the third sides, which is the first and third letter. So JL is congruent to side RT. So JL is congruent to side RT. So using your congruent statement is actually very helpful to identify corresponding parts that are congruent. So you can see this triangle is rotated and reflected. So now we can see what matches up, but it's not as easy to identify like this. So let's use the congruent statement instead. Angle S is congruent to angle Y. Angle T is congruent to angle X. And angle U is congruent to angle Z. And we can also use it for sides as well. So let's look at our first two letters. Side ST is congruent to side YZ. So segment ST is congruent to segment YZ. Let's look at our second two letters. Side TU is congruent to side XZ. And our third side is the first and third letter. So side SU is congruent to side YZ. And I didn't mark anything in the picture because we just used our congruent statement. Okay, even if you use your congruent statement, you should mark it in the picture. So let's do it again. This one's very tricky because it's actually reflected and rotated. So by looking at this, you definitely might make a mistake. So if we use our congruent statement, we're much more likely to be correct. So angle A is congruent to angle P down here. So that would have been easy to accidentally mark incorrectly if you didn't use your congruent statement. Angle B is congruent to angle R. And angle C is congruent to angle Q. Let's look at the first two letters for the first two sides. So side AB is congruent to side PR. So segment AB is congruent to segment PR. Then let's look at the second two letters. Segment BC is congruent to segment RQ. And I forgot to mark the first one in our picture, so I'll go back and do that. We said that AB was congruent to PR. All right, and our third side, let's look at the first and third letters. So side AC is congruent to side PQ. And we're done. So using your congruent statement is much easier than using the picture. Which congruent statement is correct? All right, so let's look. Is J congruent to angle M? J and angle M. Nope. J has 2 tick marks, M has 1. So that is not the correct congruent statement. Is J congruent with N? See, J has 2 tick marks and N has 2 tick marks. How about K? K has 1 tick mark and M has 1 tick mark. And what about L and P? L has 3 tick marks and P has 3 tick marks. So yes, this congruent statement does work. I'm not even going to check the third one because it says which congruent statement is correct, and we already found the correct one. So in this diagram, we have two triangles that are congruent to each other, which means that all the sides are congruent and all the angles are congruent. So if I want to find the length of XZ, I need to find its corresponding side. So XZ corresponds to PR, and PR is 10 units long, which means that the length of XZ is 10 units long. Find the measure of angle Q. Q corresponds to Y, and the measure of angle Y is 95 degrees, which means that the measure of angle Q is also 95 degrees. So use your congruence statement to find the corresponding part to see if you know its measure. So again, find the measure of segment DF. Well, what does segment DF correspond to in the first triangle? It corresponds to AC, the first and third letter. So if AC is 3, then we know that the measurement of DF is 3. And the measure of angle B, well, B corresponds to angle E, and B is 28 degrees, which means that, sorry, E is 28 degrees, which means that measure of angle B is also 28 degrees. Sometimes you'll get some triangles like this, and you just have to be careful when you're naming angles. I'm not going to go through everything, but there's two separate angles here, so you can't call that angle E because you don't know which one you're talking about. So this angle, you would have to name it as angle DEF, and this angle you would have to name as angle FEG or angle GEF. It doesn't matter. Okay, and same thing down here. This would be named as angle DFE. Oops, sorry, you can't see that. Angle DFE. And this angle here would be angle GFE. GFE. Yep. So you got it. You have to use 3 letters to name these angles when there's 2 angles at one vertex. And then the congruence statement. So when you write the congruence statement, ooh, I forgot to do that for these examples. All right. I'm not going to list congruent angles and congruent sides for these, but let's talk about writing the congruence statement. This is your, when you're saying that the two triangles are congruent, that's your congruent statement. So when you do that, you have to match up the parts. So angle A has 3 tick marks, so angle A is congruent to angle F. And then B has 1 tick mark and D has 1 tick mark, so B matches up with D, and C has 2 tick marks and E has 2 tick marks, so C has to match up with E. Doesn't matter which letter you start with. I could also say triangle BAC is congruent to triangle DFE, or I could say triangle CAB is congruent to triangle EFD. It doesn't matter. There's many different orders you could do. It doesn't matter what letter you start with. It's just that A has to match up with F, B has to match up with D, and C has to match up with E. So in this next example, if we write a congruence statement, right? Triangle EGF. So we did 1 angle mark, 2 angle marks, and then the 90 degree. So we have to do the same thing over here. 1 angle mark is K, 2 angle marks is J, and the 90 degree is L. So now if we write it, let's try to write a congruent statement for this example. So this left triangle, doesn't matter what letter you start with. We can, let's start at D, and then we'll go F, E is congruent to triangle. So we started with 2 tick marks, then 3 tick marks, then 1. So we got to start with 2 tick marks, which is G, 3 tick marks, which is F, and 1 tick mark, which is E. So triangle DFE is congruent to triangle GFE. And I will talk about this on day 2. So that's some review that we'll need for section 5.2. Sorry, so I will talk about it in section 5.2.